When we think about the cross of Christ, when we think about Jesus, I remember being a kid in church and people joking that the answer was always Jesus. And as I've gotten older and as I have matured in my faith, I have come to the place where I really legitimately believe that. I don't think of it as a joke so much, that like Christ really is the answer for all of our hope, all of our peace, all of our joy, all of our righteousness, all of our forgiveness is found in Jesus. The purpose of life is knowing Christ. Eternal life is knowing God the Father and Jesus Christ whom he sent. Like, it really does come down to Christ. Meet me, if you would, please, in 1 Corinthians 9. We're going to not finish with Paul, but we're going to take a break from Paul, the letters from Paul after this week, and we're going to start an Advent series next week. But today I want to preach a message from 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, and if you'll meet me in 1 Corinthians 9 in just a moment, that would be wonderful. Here's what we have on tap today. Our rights serve and submit to the gospel of Jesus and not the other way around. Our rights serve and submit to the gospel of Jesus and not the other way around. Our application today is this: we must exercise discipline and self-control in all things for the sake of the gospel. And our prayer today is, God, discipline me by your Spirit to live a life that glorifies you and upholds the gospel. If you're wondering what the family focus is today, if you're wondering how do we talk about this with our kids at home, live so that people can know Jesus. Live your life so that people can know Jesus. This idea of our rights serve and submit to the gospel of Jesus and not the other way around, I think that a lot of times we get that backwards as Christians, and we think that what we need to be most passionate about is our rights and the things that we can do or the things that we feel free to do, and we are more passionate about our rights and privileges than we are the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of the things to note, so in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, 10, and 11 are one conversation. It's one thought, those 4 chapters. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, what we're dealing with is that there are a group of Christians who are eating meat that's been sacrificed to a false god, to an idol. The Corinthian community is very pagan, and they serve false gods. And the Christian community within that, they serve the true God, Yahweh God. And some of the people who are in the Christian church are eating meat from the market that had been sacrificed to an idol. They're eating this meat that's been sacrificed to an idol, and it's not that's wrong. It's not that that's wrong. Paul says, look, we know that an idol is nothing. We know that an idol has no real value. And he goes, you can eat meat sacrificed to an idol. He goes, but there are people in your midst that don't have that maturity yet. They don't have that knowledge yet. They don't have that wisdom yet. And it's messing up how they see the gospel. So imagine, if you would, that you're a mature Christian. You went to the meat market. You bought the best piece of steak, which for whatever reason happened to be the one that was sacrificed to an idol. You're coming home. You're preparing it. But yesterday, somebody became a Christian. Yesterday, your next door neighbor, yesterday became a Christian. Yesterday, they were serving this false god, and now here they are with you, and you're eating meat sacrificed to an idol. It confused it in their minds, and they were saying, okay, so we serve Jesus and this idol, and it made the gospel messy. So Paul says, look, you have the right to eat meat sacrificed to an idol, but just because you have the right doesn't mean you should do it. You need to be more concerned about how people perceive the gospel. And then in chapter 9, Paul says, for example, I have the right to take a wife with me if I want to, and to have her travel with me on all my missionary journeys, just like Peter did. And he goes, but I haven't done that. And he goes, I also have the right to require of you, Corinthian church, that you support my preaching habit, that you pay me for preaching. And he goes, but I haven't taken advantage of that right either. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 9, the second half of verse 12. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:12, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. We endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Jesus. I don't think that that's probably how most Christians feel. Paul says, I will give up any right of mine for the sake of the gospel of Jesus. I think that a lot of times we're more concerned with protecting our rights than we are protecting and preserving the gospel. Now, this is not a political message. This has nothing to do with us voting this past week. That's not even why I prepared this message. It was always going to be my last message from Paul. So you can have political leanings, and you can have political feelings, and you can have strong feelings about our country, and that's fine. Paul's encouragement is that I have rights that I will lay aside for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. one of the things that I want us to look at here is 1 Corinthians 9. Join me in verse 19. 1 Corinthians 9:19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. To the Jew I became like a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I'm not outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. All right, Paul is very convoluted right here. I wish that he was more plain. He uses a lot of parenthetical statements. He repeats himself a lot. Here's what he's just said. Paul said, for the sake of the gospel, he goes, among the Jews, I behave like a Jew. When I'm among the Jews, I'm going to act like a Jew. I'm going to observe the law that they're observing. Why? So that that's not a distraction when I'm preaching to them the gospel of Jesus. He goes, when I'm amongst the Gentiles, he goes, I have freedom from the law, and I'm going to act like a Gentile who's free from the law so that I'm not confusing the gospel for them, and I'm just going to present the gospel to them. And then he says, and to the weak, I'm like the weak, so that I can win some of the weak. Now, the weak here isn't physically weak. The weak here, based on what he says in Romans 14, Paul says that there are some who believe that one day is holy above another day, and then there are those who believe all days are the same. He says there are some who believe you can't eat certain foods. He calls them weak in their faith. And then there are those who are strong in their faith who say, no, we can eat anything. So there are some who are weak in their faith that feel like they have to treat one day as more holy than another. Or there are some who are weak in their faith who feel like they have to abstain from certain foods. And Paul says, when I'm ministering to them, I kind of adopt their behavior. I won't eat what they don't eat. And why? Why does Paul do this? For the sake of the gospel. The thing that matters the most to Paul is Jesus. I remember being in in Lubbock, I was part of a very good college ministry. But one of the criticisms that I would have of it looking back is that we were really intent upon changing people's behavior. We were more intent, in fact, upon changing people's behavior than we were that they knew Jesus. We would roll into a place and we'd say, hey, you're not doing this correctly. You should really do this differently. Hey, you shouldn't be behaving this way. Hey, you shouldn't be asking this way. And the last questions that we would get to are, let me tell you about Jesus. Do you know who Jesus is? That's not what Paul does. Paul would roll into a group of people. He'd kind of see what they're like, and he's like, okay, I'll blend in with this group so that I have an opportunity to share Christ with them. And then when he was at the next group, and this isn't saying go act however you want to, because Paul says, I'm still under the law of Christ. He's still serving Jesus. But I think that a lot of times what we do when we see maybe somebody who has a theological difference, a disagreement with us, our first reaction is to correct that in them instead of saying, look, let me help you know who Christ is. Our first reaction is to try to correct people's behavior rather than to try to help them to know Jesus. I've used this example a lot, and I'll continue to use it, but my dad was not a good person. He was a dog and just a miserable kind of man and an unhappy man. And, well, I don't know. He would probably think that he was very happy. Very few people around him were, though. So take that for however you want to. And as my dad was dying, a lot of people said, are you really hoping there's an opportunity for reconciliation here? Are you really hoping that you and your dad can reconcile and that he'll apologize? And I'm like, no, man. Like, I don't care. I'm a full-grown adult now. I'm all right. And my goal was never that my dad would own up to the things that he had done. My goal for my dad was never that he would apologize or reconcile with me. I had one goal for my dad, and that's that he would know Jesus. And almost every conversation we had for the last few years of his life, and especially the last 5 months of his life, were about his relationship with Christ. Because as he drew nearer to death, my aim was not that he would apologize to me and my sisters. My aim was that he would know who Christ was. That has to be our aim. It can't be to tweak people's behavior or address their political leanings that we think are stupid. It has to be that we would help people to know Jesus. Paul says, I became all things to all people that I might win them. I do everything for the sake of the gospel. And I just wonder really how often that's our motivation as believers. Are we motivated by the gospel, or are we motivated by our rights? Are we motivated by the gospel, or are we motivated by our preferences? Look at this. Here's our application today. We must exercise discipline and self-control in all things for the sake of the gospel. We must exercise discipline and self-control in all things for the sake of the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27. Love these verses. They say this. Do you not know that in a race all the runners compete, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable wreath. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified from the prize. This verse gets used a lot in Christian sports scenarios, and it's kind of the pep talk that we give people like before they go back out onto the field or onto the court or onto the track or whatever. And this has nothing to do with athletics except for that Paul is using athletics as an example for how we should approach the gospel. So one of the things that's really interesting is at this time in history, of course, the Olympics have been going on for a long time. The Olympics are the premier physical competition in the world. But second to that, and very close, like a close second to that, were the games that were held in Corinth every other year called the Isthmian Games. I cannot pronounce that any better than that. It sounds like I have a lisp, I know, but I don't know. Isthmian Games, I don't know. Maybe that's not how it's pronounced, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it, and it will forever be that way. So these games, when Rome kind of took over the world in the early 2nd century BC, Rome took these games as well. And in 40 AD, the games had returned to Corinth. And so Paul was in Corinth a decade or so after that. And so the games were back in Corinth, and everybody was super excited about them. So when Paul's talking here about this, he's talking about things that they understood. So when he says, do you not know that all the runners in a race run, but only one receives the prize? He is talking about things that the Corinthian community would know full well. These are things every other year they had these games. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things, he says. If you were going to compete in these games, you would go into a 10-month training and you would swear an oath before the emperor that you would not cheat and that you would honor the conduct of the games for the next 10 months. And you would take no wine and no fatty food and have no sexual relationships, and you would prepare yourself for the games and compete according to the rules over the next 10 months. And so when he says this, that they would exercise self-control on all things, he is talking about that very thing. He says they did it to receive a perishable wreath. At this point in Corinth, the perishable wreath that they would receive was made of celery plant. Thank you. That's super exciting, right? And there wasn't a second place celery plant. It was first place. So these athletes are training themselves for 10 months to compete in these events to get the first place celery leaf. Eventually, it would be replaced by fir branches, which does sound better somehow, but is less useful in your stuffing at Thanksgiving. And so... And so Paul says, these athletes, look at the kind of discipline, look at the kind of self-control they exude for a leafy branch. And he goes, we should do so because we're seeking the crown of life. We're seeking to do this for the kingdom of God. We're seeking to do this. So what he says is, look, I want you to see this perfect example you have in your community, Corinthians, of how these athletes discipline themselves and they train themselves. And we ought to do this not so that we can be a Christian, CrossFit group or something like that together, but so that we can discipline ourselves for the sake of the gospel that the world would know Jesus. The same kind of discipline that this athlete puts into their body so they can win celery, we ought to for the sake of the name of Jesus Christ. That ought to be our kind of discipline, that we will lay aside our rights, that we will lay aside our preferences, not that you can't have them, but that we put them down in view of the gospel of Jesus, that our primary leading and goal is the gospel of Christ. And before you say to me, well, Ryan, I'm not Paul, and Ryan, I'm not even a preacher, I want to remind you that all of us as Christians represent the gospel. All of us who have named the name Jesus, our chief aim in our marriages and as we raise our kids and in our workplaces and in our communities and with the people you're just going to bump into doing life, our chief aim for them is Jesus Christ. When Paul implies that we have more at stake than a wreath of leaves, he is talking about the eternal souls of men and women. That's what's at stake. So discipline yourself for it, he says. Train yourself for it. I tell people all the time that we don't ever become anything by accident, and I believe that. I don't believe that you become anything by accident. You are practicing right now for the kind of person you will be in 5 years. You're training yourself right now for the kind of person you'll be right now, or in 5 years. And if you're passive right now, and I don't mean politically so, but if you're inactive and if you're not taking steps to train yourself for who you'll want to be in 5 years, that is the training. And you will become more apathetic and more like we become who we're training ourselves to be. Paul says, discipline yourself, train yourself for the purpose of the gospel. What does that look like for you? I can't exactly tell you what that would look like for you as an individual. I know what it looks like for me as an individual, but what does it look like for you to discipline yourself for the purpose of the gospel, to have your marriage be about the gospel, to have the kids that you're raising be about the gospel, to have the people that you work with know that you are a person who is committed to the gospel? Now, the next thing that Paul's going to do, and it feels very disconnected, but it's not at all. So he's asking the Corinthian church to train themselves and to discipline themselves. Please do not lose sight that he hasn't shifted his conversation yet. He's still talking about the same thing, about these rights that these people have, and you need to lay them down for the sake of your brethren. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:1, I want you to know, brothers, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things took place as examples for us, so that we wouldn't desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. So here's the story. Paul says, discipline yourself for godliness. Discipline yourself for the purpose of representing Christ. And he goes, consider our ancestors. Consider these people who had been slaves in Egypt for 430 years that Moses led out into the wilderness. And God led them by a pillar of cloud by day and was a pillar of fire by night. And wherever that cloud and that tower of fire went, the people went. And when the pillar of cloud would stop, the people would stop and set up camp. And when the pillar left, they would follow it. And God led them for 40 years, physically led them for 40 years in the wilderness. And he said they were all under the same cloud. They all passed through the Red Sea, right? They had gone into the Red Sea, Exodus 14. The waters had parted to the left and to the right. The people of God went through on the dry land. The Egyptian army came in behind them. Their chariot wheels got stuck in the mud, and the waters collapsed on top of the Egyptian army, drowning them all. And then he says they all ate the same spiritual food, manna. Bread from heaven fell for 40 years and was across the ground every morning for them, barring the Sabbath. And then he said, and they all drank from the same spiritual rock, which is Christ, that followed them in the wilderness. And so that's Exodus 17. And in Exodus 17, the people are about to put Moses to death because they're like, man, you brought us into the desert. We're dying of thirst. And God tells Moses, strike this rock. And Moses strikes the rock and it splits open and water pours from it and rushes across and is enough to quench the thirst of 1,000,002 people and all their livestock. It's an amazing thing. They had seen the power of God. They had seen God demonstrate his mighty power over the Egyptians through 10 plagues. And then it says, but then look at what they did. 3 months. This is how long it took for the people to go, yeah, we're done with God. 3 months. In fact, they were kind of done with them before because according to Ezekiel, when they left Egypt, they had just seen God destroy the gods of the Egyptians. The true God destroyed the idols of Egypt. And it says they carried up all the idols of Egypt with them and took them with them into the wilderness. All right, God, you're pretty good, but we'll take these gods too, just in case. 3 months later, they're at Mount Sinai. The mountain is covered with smoke, covered in fire. It's trembling and shaking at the voice of God, which sounds like thunder and the voice of trumpets or the sound of trumpets. And the people see it, and they watch Moses go up into the cloud and the darkness, and he's up there for 40 days, and somewhere in that 40 days, they're like, I guess Moses isn't coming back. Let's make an idol that we can serve, and that'll be our God. It took them 30 to 40 days, 3 months, 3.5 to 4 months for them to say, we're done with God. And Paul says, let this be an example to us. Let this be a warning to us. They sat down to eat and drink. They rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day. That is a reference to the end of the 40 years in the wilderness. That's from Numbers chapters 22 through, specifically Numbers 25, but Numbers 22 through 24, culminating in 25. And the people of God at that time were like, you know what, we're done with God. Let's marry with these other people. Let's serve their gods instead. It goes on to say that we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and they were destroyed by snakes. That's a reference to Numbers 21. We must not grumble, as some of them did, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. Probably also a reference to Numbers 21, but maybe also Numbers 16. Now, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instructions. Therefore, be careful if anyone thinks he stands, lest he fall. Now, why does Paul say this in this context? Let's think it through for a minute. You have the right to eat meat sacrificed to an idol, he says. You have the right to do that. An idol's nothing. An idol doesn't mean anything. We know that there's no God but one. You want to eat meat sacrificed to an idol? Go ahead. But for the sake of the gospel, you probably shouldn't. Because there are people in your midst who it's confusing the gospel for them. Paul goes, as an example, I have the right to take on a wife, but for the sake of the gospel, I never did. He goes, furthermore, I have the right to demand of you Corinthians that you support me financially, like every other church has supported me. And he goes, but for the sake of the gospel among you, I didn't. What Paul just said about the Corinthian church is that they were weak. All the other churches were happy to support Paul. The Corinthian church wasn't for whatever reason. So Paul goes, all right, I won't take any money from you because the gospel matters more to me than you supporting me. I'll make tents. Everybody goes, Paul was a tent maker. The only place we see Paul making tents was in Corinth, where they weren't supporting him. Okay? And so here he is, and he's like, look, I did that for the sake of the gospel. He goes, I laid that right down. He goes, look at your athletes. Look at how they discipline themselves. Look at how they train themselves for celery. And he goes, and you guys, for the gospel. He goes, you want to be reminded? You want to be reminded of how your heart can be dragged away from the important things? He goes, look at our ancestors. Look at our ancestors who saw God in the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. Look at our ancestors who passed through the Red Sea. Look at our ancestors who drank from the spiritual rock that is Christ. Look at our ancestors who ate manna and how quickly they were to say, now we'll serve a different God instead. He goes, be careful. You need to be careful. He's warning them. You need to be careful about the things that would subvert the gospel. You need to be careful about the things that might undermine the truth of Christ. And he goes, these things happen to them as an example for us so that we would be careful. He goes, you think, verse 12, he goes, you think you're standing. You better be careful. You're about to fall. Be careful when you think, oh, I got this. You're about to fall. Look what he says in verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except for what is common to man. God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, but with every temptation will provide a way of escape so that you can endure it. Don't lift this verse out of its context. What's the temptation? I can eat meat sacrificed to an idol. He goes, yeah, you can. He goes, be careful. Be careful. There will be things that will undermine the gospel of Christ, but anything that comes in to seeks to undermine the gospel of Christ, God will make a way for you to get out of that. What's chief? What's the first aim? What's the goal? The gospel. And there will be rights you have and things that you have that you're going to say, oh, these are okay. Look at this. Look at verse 10 or chapter 10, verse 23 and 24. He is still talking about the same thing here. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not everything builds up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Right? What has Paul said? Give up your right to eat meat sacrificed to idol. For whose sake? For the sake of the weaker person, for the sake of the gospel. He goes, is it lawful for you? Is it permissible for you to do this? Sure. It's lawful, it's permissible, but does it build up the body? Does it correctly represent the gospel? And he goes, so don't think I have the right to do this. Don't think I'm doing this for my good, for my sake. He goes, think instead I'm doing this for theirs. Let your behavior be directed by the gospel, not by your perceived rights. We speak and we think and we act according to the things that weigh most heavily upon our hearts. And Christian, the thing that should weigh most heavily upon our hearts is the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And we should think and speak and act accordingly. That the gospel is the thing that carries the most weight. We discipline our bodies. I tell my boys a lot, and Asher finally asked me recently, he goes, where did you hear that? Or did you just make it up? And I think it's probably a combination of a lot of different things that I've heard. But I say, if you want to be better than the other person, you've got to put in more work than they do. Right? To be better than the next guy, you got to do more than the next guy's doing. Like, discipline yourself, train yourself. We go, yeah, I want to represent the gospel, but I'm not really interested in putting in the time. I mean, really, that's what we're communicating. Right? No, look, I hear what you're saying, Ryan, right now in the back of your head. I hear what you're saying, but politics and everything going on in our country, I get it. Vote, be a voice for change, but first, represent Jesus. Ryan, you don't understand the wrong that this person did to me. Look, don't invite him over for Thanksgiving. That's okay. My goodness. Like, I like my space and I like my bubble. I just do. And when you're going to talk to me, like, give me like 18 or 24 inches, you know? I like my room. I'm a hugger. It's okay. I can hug you and say hello, but then let's both. It's kind of like touching two magnets with opposite, like with the same poles to each other, and you can make them touch, but then they spring apart. Let's do that. Let's come into each other's circles for a little bit and then spring apart and be like, it was really nice to see. Like, that's how I'm wired, right? Like, have your preferences. I like my space. But for the sake of the gospel, come into my space. For the sake of the gospel, does that make sense? Like, we have to discipline ourselves. What has to matter most is the gospel. And we want to argue with people about tattoos and drinking and whether or not Sunday is actually the Sabbath. It's not. And we want to talk to people about all sorts of things other than Jesus. Listen to this. Man, people memorize this verse, but they need to memorize this one. They need to understand the context. Listen to 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not just rip that verse out of its context and just wave it around, okay? Keep it in mind. These people are saying, we can eat meat sacrificed to an idol. And Paul goes, yeah, you're right, you can. But you're hurting some people's faith because they don't understand the gospel now. You're confusing the gospel. So if you're going to eat or if you're going to drink or whatever you do it for the glory of God, not because it's your right. The context here of 1 Corinthians 10:31 isn't self-satisfaction. It is the glory of God, the representation of the gospel. So whether you eat meat sacrificed to an idol or whether you don't, do it to glorify God, right? And then look what he says. If you're going to memorize verse 31, or if you've already memorized it, my challenge to you would go ahead and memorize the next two. Give no offense to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone and everything, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, so that what? So they may be saved. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Cause no offense to the Jew, cause no offense to the Greek, cause no offense to the church of God. Do not seek your own advantage, but theirs, that they may know Christ. I became all things to all people. To the Jew, I acted like a Jew. To the Greek, I acted like a Greek. Amongst the church, we conduct ourselves in holiness so that they can know Jesus. That's the goal. That's the aim. That's the purpose. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Listen to this. This is Paul now at the end of his life. And Paul says in 2 Timothy 4:6-7, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Everybody talks about how they want to hear Jesus say at the end of their lives, well done, good and faithful servant. I would like the moment prior to that for me to be able to say, I fought the good fight. I finished the race. That I have disciplined myself for the purpose of making Jesus known. I have privileges. I have rights. I have things that, preferences, things that Micah and Pierce, like, they're just better men than me. they like people better than me. I don't want you to hear this wrong. I like you. I love you and I pray for you, and there isn't anywhere else I'd rather be. I would just prefer to kind of bury myself in a cave if I could. I'm more of an introvert. That's why, and Micah has made fun of me for this for years, and he has to remind me, but that's why, like, if I throw a party or whatever, or if I have people over, I always put an end time. It's a way for me to say, now go home. Micah has reminded me through the years, there are some events where you don't put an end time, Ryan. It's just like, hey, come over and hang out. And then when you're done hanging out, it just kind of, and I'm like, yeah, but how will they know when I'm done? Like, look, the Thanksgiving dinner at our house tonight is drive-by. It's 6 o'clock to 6:15. I'm kidding. When you see the table and the made plates out front, just drive through the Circle Drive, roll that, and we'll all sit in our cars and wave it. I'm not that bad. I'm really not. Like, I am a little more social than that, but only a little more social than that. And that's okay. That's all right, isn't it? But I lay down everything for the sake of what? The gospel. So my preference serves the gospel and not the other way around. You with me? So that we can get to the end of our days and say, I fought the fight. I finished the race. Why? For the sake of the gospel, that those people that I'm encountering might know Christ. And it brings us to our prayer today. God, discipline me by your Spirit to live a life that glorifies you and upholds the gospel. God, discipline me by your Spirit to live a life that glorifies you and upholds the gospel. That everything I do would serve the gospel purpose of Jesus Christ. Would you take just a moment to pray that where you are? That everything that God is doing in your life, that he would discipline you and train you to represent the gospel well? God, I thank you. I thank you for people who are extroverts. And I thank you, God, for people who are driven. And I thank you, God, for people who kind of like to just stay in their own bubble. And I thank you for people who have focus and drive and passion. And I thank you for those that maybe need the encouragement of someone else. I just thank you for people. We're very different. We're wired differently, Lord, and we have different preferences and different tendencies. But the thing that we share in common is Jesus. And I thank you for Jesus. I thank you for the cross. I thank you that Christ died and was raised from the dead, that his shed blood is for our forgiveness of sins. And I thank you, God, that faith in Jesus saves us and that we can know with confidence that Christ is returning one day. And I pray, Lord, that we would live our lives. We would live our lives with that as the pinnacle force that drives us forward. That we would discipline ourselves for the purpose of godliness. That we would discipline ourselves to represent well the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that in everything we do, we would bring you glory.